The war between Russia and Ukraine stands as one of the most defining conflicts of the modern era, a war that shattered long-held assumptions about peace in Europe and exposed the fragile foundations of the global order. What began as political tension and regional unrest escalated into a full-scale invasion that shocked the world. Cities were reduced to ruins, millions were displaced, and the balance of power between nations was profoundly altered. To understand this war, one must go beyond headlines and battle maps and explore the deep historical roots, the brutal realities of combat, and the far-reaching consequences that continue to shape the world today. Ukraine's story is inseparable from geography. Sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Eurasia, Ukraine has for centuries been a land contested by empires. Its fertile plains, strategic rivers, and access to the Black Sea made it both a prize and a battleground. Over time, Ukrainian lands fell under the control of powerful neighbors, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottoman Empire, and most significantly, the Russian Empire. This long history of domination left Ukraine with a strong sense of cultural identity but limited political independence. In the late 18th century, much of modern Ukraine was absorbed into the Russian Empire. Russian rulers viewed Ukraine not as a separate nation, but as an extension of Russia itself. Ukrainian language and culture were often suppressed, and efforts to assert a distinct national identity were met with resistance. This pattern continued under the Soviet Union, where Ukraine became one of the most important Soviet republics, contributing heavily to agriculture, industry, and military power. The Soviet era left deep scars. One of the darkest chapters was the Holodomor famine of the early 1930s, when millions of Ukrainians died as a result of forced collectivization and state policies. For many Ukrainians, this tragedy became a symbol of oppression and a reminder of the dangers of centralized control from Moscow. Though Ukraine played a key role in the Soviet victory during World War II, memories of suffering and sacrifice strengthened the desire for self-determination. In 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union finally gave Ukraine its independence. For the first time in modern history, Ukraine emerged as a sovereign state recognized by the international community. However, independence did not bring immediate stability. Ukraine inherited economic challenges, political corruption, and a complex relationship with Russia, which continued to see Ukraine as strategically vital. Russia's concerns were rooted in both history and security. Ukraine served as a buffer between Russia and NATO, the Western military alliance that had expanded steadily eastward since the end of the Cold War. For Russian leaders, particularly Vladimir Putin, Ukraine drifting to the west represented not only a geopolitical loss, but also a threat to Russia's influence and identity. Putin repeatedly argued that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, rejecting the idea of Ukraine as a fully independent nation. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Ukraine found itself pulled between two paths: closer integration with Europe or continued alignment with Russia. This struggle played out in elections, street protests, and political crises. The Orange Revolution of 2004 was a turning point as mass demonstrations overturned a fraudulent election and brought a pro-Western government to power. Though hopes were high, internal divisions and political infighting soon weakened reforms. By 2013, tensions reached a breaking point. When Ukraine's president suspended preparations for an association agreement with the European Union, thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets in protest. These demonstrations, known as the Euromaidan movement, grew into a nationwide uprising demanding democratic reforms, transparency, and a European future. The protests were met with violence, and dozens of demonstrators were killed. Eventually, the president fled the country, and a new government took power. Russia viewed these events as a direct threat. In 2014, Russian forces moved swiftly to seize Crimea, a peninsula of immense strategic importance. Crimea housed Russia's Black Sea Fleet and held deep symbolic value. The annexation was carried out with speed and precision, followed by a controversial referendum that Russia used to justify its actions. The international community condemned the move, imposing sanctions and declaring the annexation illegal. At the same time, unrest spread in eastern Ukraine. In the Donbass region, armed groups backed by Russia declared independence from Kyiv. Fighting erupted between Ukrainian forces and separatists, marking the beginning of a war that would simmer for nearly 8 years. Despite ceasefires and diplomatic efforts, including the Minsk agreements, violence never fully stopped. Thousands were killed, and the region became a frozen conflict zone. For years, the world watched as tensions slowly escalated. Russia built up its military, modernized its armed forces, and tested Western resolve. Ukraine, meanwhile, strengthened its army, sought Western support, and deepened its national identity. What once seemed unlikely began to feel inevitable. In late 2021, satellite images revealed massive Russian troop movements near Ukraine's borders. Diplomatic warnings intensified, but hopes for a peaceful resolution remained. Then, in the early hours of February 24, 2022, the war entered a new and devastating phase. Russian missiles struck cities across Ukraine, and ground forces advanced from multiple directions. Europe woke up to the reality of large-scale war for the first time in generations. Russia claimed its invasion was necessary to protect Russian-speaking populations and prevent NATO expansion. Ukraine and its allies rejected these claims, calling the invasion an act of aggression and a violation of international law. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky refused to flee, rallying the nation with messages of defiance and unity. His leadership quickly became a symbol of resistance. The early days of the invasion were marked by chaos and uncertainty. Russian forces aimed to capture Kyiv quickly, believing the Ukrainian government would collapse. But Ukrainian defenses held firm. Civilians joined territorial defense units, barricades were erected, and fierce fighting erupted on the outskirts of the capital. The failure to take Kyiv became one of Russia's first major setbacks. As Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine, the scale of destruction became clear. Entire towns lay in ruins, and evidence of civilian killings shocked the world. These revelations hardened international resolve and led to increased military aid for Ukraine. Advanced weapons, intelligence support, and financial assistance flowed in from Western countries. Meanwhile, the focus of the war shifted east and south. Battles for cities like Mariupol became symbols of both suffering and resistance. Mariupol endured relentless bombardment, with civilians trapped without food, water, or electricity. The eventual fall of the city came at a huge human cost, leaving scars that will last for generations. As the war dragged on, it transformed into a brutal war of attrition. Trenches stretched across fields, artillery thundered day and night, and drones hovered constantly above the battlefield. Modern technology merged with old-style warfare, creating a conflict that was both futuristic and hauntingly familiar. This war is not only fought with weapons, but also with narratives. Information warfare, propaganda, and cyber attacks became key tools for both sides. Control of the story mattered almost as much as control of territory. Social media brought the war into living rooms around the world, making distant suffering immediate and personal. Yet beyond the battles and headlines lies the deeper question of consequences. The war between Russia and Ukraine has reshaped alliances, economies, and global security in ways that will define the coming decades. As the war entered its second phase, the focus shifted decisively to eastern and southern Ukraine, where Russia concentrated its forces in an attempt to secure territorial gains and regain momentum. The Donbass region became the heart of the conflict, not only because of its industrial importance, but also because of its symbolic value to both sides. Town by town, village by village, the war settled into a brutal grind, with artillery bombardments shaping the rhythm of daily life. Russian strategy relied heavily on overwhelming firepower. Massive artillery barrages flattened neighborhoods before ground forces advanced, leaving behind landscapes of devastation. Cities like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk became names synonymous with destruction. Ukrainian defenders, often outnumbered and outgunned, relied on mobility, intelligence, and morale to slow the advance. Each street and factory became a battlefield, turning urban spaces into deadly traps. One of the most significant turning points in the war came as Ukraine began to receive increasing amounts of Western military aid. Precision-guided weapons, advanced air defense systems, and real-time intelligence support changed the balance on the battlefield. For the first time, Ukrainian forces were able to strike deep behind Russian lines, targeting ammunition depots, command centers, and supply routes. These strikes disrupted Russian logistics and exposed weaknesses in its military planning. The introduction of modern rocket systems transformed the conflict. Long-range precision fire allowed Ukraine to counter Russia's numerical advantage in artillery. Bridges, railways, and supply hubs became prime targets, particularly in the southern regions. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by front lines, but by a web of logistics that could be attacked from afar. As summer turned to autumn, Ukraine launched a bold counteroffensive in the northeast. In a carefully planned operation, Ukrainian forces achieved rapid breakthroughs, liberating large areas in a matter of days. Russian units, caught off guard, retreated in disarray. The liberation of key towns marked one of the most dramatic shifts in momentum since the start of the war and demonstrated Ukraine's growing military capability. These gains had a profound psychological impact. For Ukrainians, they proved that victory was possible. For Russia, they exposed the limits of its power. In response, Moscow announced a partial mobilization, calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists. The decision sparked domestic unrest and led many Russians to flee the country, revealing cracks in public support for the war. The mobilization marked a dangerous escalation. New troops were rushed to the front with limited training, while missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure intensified. Power plants, water facilities, and heating systems were targeted in an attempt to break civilian morale. As winter approached, millions of Ukrainians faced blackouts and freezing temperatures, turning survival itself into a daily struggle. Despite these hardships, Ukraine adapted. Engineers worked around the clock to restore power, while communities organized to support one another. The struggle hardened Ukrainian national identity, uniting people across language and regional lines. The struggle was no longer just for territory, but for the survival of the nation itself. In the south, the battle for control of key river crossings became decisive. Ukraine's methodical campaign against supply routes forced Russian forces to withdraw from strategically important positions. The liberation of major southern cities signaled another major success and demonstrated the effectiveness of combining military pressure with strategic patience. Meanwhile, the war's human cost continued to rise. Millions of Ukrainians fled to neighboring countries, creating the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Families were separated, lives put on hold, and entire communities uprooted. Those who remained endured constant shelling, loss, and uncertainty. War crimes allegations added another layer of tragedy. Reports of civilian killings, mass graves, and forced deportations emerged from previously occupied areas. International investigators documented evidence that shocked the world and deepened calls for accountability. These revelations further isolated Russia diplomatically and strengthened support for Ukraine. On the global stage, the war reshaped alliances and economic systems. Sanctions imposed on Russia targeted banks, energy exports, and technology imports. While designed to weaken Russia's war effort, these measures also sent shockwaves through the global economy. Energy prices surged, inflation rose, and countries dependent on grain imports faced food insecurity. The war also accelerated shifts in global power. NATO expanded its presence in Eastern Europe, reinforcing its eastern flank. Nations that once maintained neutrality reconsidered their positions, seeking protection in a more uncertain world. Defense budgets increased, and military readiness became a priority across Europe. As months turned into years, the conflict settled into a prolonged struggle. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, and front lines shifted only slowly. The war became a test of endurance, resources, and political will. For Ukraine, continued support from allies was crucial. For Russia, sustaining the war effort in the face of sanctions and losses became increasingly challenging. Yet even in the midst of destruction, the war sparked profound questions about the future of international order. Could borders still be changed by force? Would global institutions be able to enforce rules and norms? The answers remained uncertain, but the implications were clear. The world had entered a new era of instability. As the fighting continued, attention turned toward what the war would leave behind. Entire cities would need rebuilding. Millions would need to return home. Deep psychological wounds would take generations to heal. The cost of reconstruction would be immense, but so would the determination to rebuild.